Good afternoon. I'm Michael Markowitz. I'm director of the Institute for Retired Professionals. IRP has been a part of the New School community for 52 years, where adults come together to learn together, and we have had for the past 12 years this program, which is our outreach to the community. The programs are developed by a committee of IRP students to bring interesting and timely topics to the IRP curriculum. To find out more about the IRP, sign up at the clipboard at the door, and we will invite you to a meeting to learn what we do and how we do it. First, please turn off all cell phones and reading devices, since we are recording this for the student station. Try not to use the center aisle. If you have to come or go, try to stay out of camera range, etc. Now, let me welcome you again, and let me introduce Mary Ann Nelson, a student in the IRP program, who will introduce today's program. Mary Ann, you're on.
It's my pleasure to be able to introduce my old friend, Donna Lieberman. We've known each other since law school, which I guess is 40-some years. Donna was always an exceptional person. She was a leader and always a social activist. She was a leader in the law school. Our class of 70, we graduated in 73, was extremely unusual because they accepted the normal amount of people, and all these women showed up. It was sort of the beginning of a wave of feminism in everything, all the professions, I think more so. And we had a really strong women's group, and Donna was always a leader in that. Rutgers formed the Women's Rights Clinic, legal clinic. But the story I wanted to tell, in which we were partners in crime, was the yearbook was called The Legacy. And we took over from in this school that had been predominantly male, and the yearbook for the year that we started, 70, had a page for the women's activities with a go-go girl on it. So our women's group kidnapped, as it were, the yearbooks, and we wouldn't release them until they made good on it. And we got them to, I think, both apologize and rip the page out of all the yearbooks. But that's what it was like, and we were in the forefront of it. Since then, Donna's been fighting for justice. She's been a social activist all these years. She's been involved in anti-war, civil rights. She's been head of the NYCLU since 2001. The NYCLU is a fighter for civil liberties, civil rights. They've been involved in reforming the Rockefeller drug laws, which had a harsh impact on minorities. Donna's been involved in abortion rights for years. They've been instrumental in, which you'll hear about, of course, the stop and frisk laws, which were unduly and extremely punitive on blacks and minorities. They were involved in demonstrations and protecting demonstrators and preserving civil liberties in the face of a lot of police intrusion. And she stands out in the tradition of Arthur Conoy, who was a great civil libertarian and taught constitutional rights at Rutgers. And she's reminds me of him a little bit these days. So here she is. I'm sure you'll enjoy it.
So two things. First of all, I can't believe that Marianne forgot to say that the name of the group, it wasn't the women's group at Rutgers that stole the yearbooks. It was some like anonymous group that called themselves the committee to take the leg out of legacy. So, I mean, if I were making up the name, I would have used that name. Now, I'm going to start in a way that you wouldn't expect from me. This is the staff of the NYCLU singing backup at our annual concert, and it says a lot about like what keeps me going.
Capeless, and the NYCLU staff. Woo!
So that's just sort of like a creative way to say, I'm an optimist. Otherwise, like, I would have like died in this job. And, you know, when Marianne and asked me to come speak here, kept asking me, what's your topic going to be? What's your topic going to be? And it's like, I cover so much turf, and there are so many things that I could talk to you for so many hours about. I just came up with like what a difference a year makes, and so I get to talk about a whole bunch of different things, or whatever I choose. I wonder if I close this, whether I'll be able to get it back again. Well, we'll see. So, and if we can't, it's just pictures. So But what a difference a year makes. And I'm talking about really since last January or thereabouts, when we ended 1 decade and change of political rule in New York City and entered into another. We moved from the man who was fiercely independent and quite well-heeled, understatement, to a city government led by a man who unabashedly describes himself as progressive. I think a year ago, the right wing nationwide was targeting Obama as a top priority. I bet if you counted the number of minutes of Obama bashing, demonizing on Fox News and the rest of them, there were more than there are now, because now they have to get ready for the 2016 elections. And I think that on the state level, we've seen the emergence of a new phenomenon, which is the demonization of our mayor. Don't worry, I am not going to tell you that he's the best thing since sliced bread. I mean, I have lots of good and critical things to say, but I think that it's interesting to me, at least, that while de Blasio has made a concerted effort to assert his leadership on the state and national level for whatever progressive means for progressives, he has also put himself into the crosshairs of the right wing. I think that's a phenomenon to watch, although you don't have to sort of look very hard to find it, whether it's, the Nordlinger affair or the connection with Sharpton, or whether his wife should have staff, Bloomberg never had to come up against these issues because he didn't, he didn't have a wife, number one, and he would never have to go to the city to pay for staff because he's got his, he could pay. He wouldn't even notice the money leaving his wallet. So he probably doesn't even carry a wallet. And while I think many of us in the city were celebrating a new era at City Hall, we're chastened just a little bit by the enormous right-wing turn that the nation and our state have taken in the past elections. You all know that the Republicans now control both houses of Congress. I shudder to think, and the Republicans now don't even need the help of the fringe, independent Democratic caucus, the so-called independent Democratic caucus, the Jeff Klein crew, the Gang of Five. It varies 3, 4, 5. They don't have to share leadership with anybody. They control the New York State Senate, and I think it's worth noting, as I have come up against already, and the newly elected folks have yet to even take office or, retake office, that among the political people that I come in contact with, all the conversations are about 2016. Everybody is jockeying for position for 2016. So the reason that I point that out is because, I like to think of myself as somebody who is not totally unsophisticated about politics. The Civil Liberties Union is nonpartisan. We don't endorse candidates, thankfully. And so we talk about issues. But we also know how to get things done in the state legislature and in city government. So we're not totally naive. But whenever I go to Albany and have to lobby about stuff, like I did for the Women's Equality Act, very intensively 2 years ago, I am blown away by how irrelevant I feel in my approach to politics. What I mean by that is, or at least to Albany politics, what I mean by that is that politics in Albany is 90% transactional. And it's never about principle, or it's almost never about principle. It's all about the horse trading. And I have never been any place in my life where I have engaged in conversations with people about things like the Women's Equality Act, where I was talking to the so-called pro-choice Republicans. You know, they called themselves pro-choice, and I never heard so many ways of saying nothing and trying to lead you to believe that you could that they would possibly go along with you, maybe if the stars aligned and something else happened. It was just mind-boggling. So you would talk to people about how it's important to codify Roe v. Wade in the state of New York. What a revolutionary position to take. And these so-called, you know, these self-styled pro-choice Republicans would say, I hear you. That's very interesting. You make some very valid points. This is really worth, I mean, total 100% bullshit, right? And they don't go anywhere. And then the other thing about Albany is what I've learned is, like, when people go out of their way to support you, right? Make a big point about how great, you know, oh, and we have Donna Lieberman from the New York Civil Liberties Union here. This is great, wonderful, we love you, right? Just watch out. So it's like not my style. Arm on the sleeve, I cry in public, you know, it's like not my style. So, you know, maybe it's a good thing all our eggs aren't in the sort of getting things done in the legislative basket. So there's a lot of bad news politically, if elections mean anything. But I think that despite the fact that November has started, you know, and we're nonpartisan. I mean, you know, we think that there's a lot of garbage in both parties, and there's also potential. When we make friends with people on the right, when their libertarian instincts, by the way, tell us that we don't want to live in a surveillance state, you know, so we do have friends and enemies on both sides. But there's already, I think, some good news. I don't know about you, but I believe that Obama's quest for a legacy will serve us well, or he might try to serve, he might be more interested in serving us well by establishing a legacy that his kids can believe in. So I think last night's speech about, you know, immigration, it's only 6 years late, but I think that's good news. I think that it's, you know, it's no substitute for comprehensive immigration reform. It's no substitute for New York doing a DREAM Act. New York couldn't even pass a DREAM Act, and it was a pathetic DREAM Act. It was about subsidies for kids. It was not, you know, anything major. And so hopefully, I mean, I don't consider his announcement to be change we can believe in. I have learned that we need to see what that change actually translates into, and whether, in fact, more people will get access to the documentation they need to come out of the shadows when they were, you know, not born here but brought here when they were 2 or 7, or they have kids here, or they're married to somebody here. There are a lot of details and a lot of devils in those details in the immigration speech last night, but I think on balance, there's hope. it's off the screen now. Sorry, no more hope. There's reason for optimism for people who believe in treating people who are newcomers like, if not our parents, our grandparents, or whatever. And there's reason for hope for those people who are just counting pennies. This will expand our tax base. That's supposed to be like a laugh line for you guys because, that the Civil Liberties Union doesn't talk about taxes. Anyway, so that's good news. I think that it is, however, important to consider that against the backdrop of Obama being sort of like the deportation king. I mean, I don't know how many of you know, but I know that he has deported more people, and broken up more families by his attempt to sort of appease the right. He's done a great job. And really, the ICE has deported tens of thousands of people, leaving behind tens and thousands of more kids, spouses, unmarried spice, who are in real heartbreak and trouble as a result. So what's going on in the city? Well, I think there's sort of good news. High hopes was the byword. We have had such high expectations of this administration. We tried to temper our expectations. It reminds me of when I first, many, many years ago, started to work for a union. It was the most progressive union in the country. It doesn't exist anymore, District 65. I don't know if anyway, I went in there, I was the executive director of the Legal Aid Lawyers Union, and we were part of 65. And I was so excited to be part of the labor movement and to be part of the most progressive union in the country. They were the ones who sent buses to Washington against the war and the civil rights movement and stuff like that. And I was so appalled when I got there, and found out that it was such an anti-democratic institution. I'm not anti-union now, but I'm sharing a personal story about how disillusioned I was when I had, unrealistic, perhaps, high expectations in my own life. The high expectations that I think many progressive New Yorkers had or have from the de Blasio administration were bound to be dashed to some extent, just like they were dashed by our president. And even those of us who didn't have high expectations, I think, were disappointed in him. But let me just talk about, in him meaning Obama, let me just talk about, I think, a couple of the issues that are near and dear to my heart and how we have fared over the last 10 months. There is indeed, I think, change we can believe in. Somehow, that's the phrase that I always use. I tweet it, is this change we can believe in? I say it. Whoever came up with that, it must be the same person who came up with the we are the 99%. I mean, it's good marketing for some reason, or at least to me. Obama, de Blasio, he'll be happy that I made that slip. Let's talk aspirations here. De Blasio campaigned on the promise of closing the book on the Tale of Two Cities. That has been the story of New York City for too long. And as I was thinking about what to say today, I think that that's really the appropriate, context in which to think about, what's happening in our city and whether there's change we can believe in and whether we should have high hopes. I guess I should start with the marijuana policy since I'm talking about high hopes. I'll get there. One of the legacies that the de Blasio administration inherited was the legacy of a city divided about policing based on race, by virtue of the heavy-handed and hyper-aggressive stop and frisk practices that Commissioner Kelly implemented, and that had the approval, if not the aggressive support of Mayor Bloomberg. And the latest numbers just came out. We get quarterly reports because it's required under city law. And whereas back at the peak, there were almost 700,000 stop and frisks of New Yorkers in a given year, almost 90% of which targeted people of color, actually 88 or thereabouts percent targeted people of color, and 90% or more were so unrelated to the legal standard, which required suspicion of wrongdoing and for a frisk, fear of a weapon, that 90% of those stop and frisks resulted in not even a summons, not an arrest, and not a summons for anything. So all but 10% of the people who were subjected to stop and frisk, the lion's share of whom were people of color, right, were stopped without a legal justification. We filed lawsuits. The Center for Constitutional Right filed one lawsuit. We filed another. Legal Aid filed another about various aspects of stop and frisk abuse. And the Bloomberg administration fought those lawsuits tooth and nail. The de Blasio administration couldn't wait to settle those lawsuits. And the Bloomberg administration made some last-ditch attempts to try to prevent them from settling the lawsuits. The good news is that in anything involving courts and law, and lawyers, takes 20 times longer than it should, and that anybody would ever imagine. But finally, just in the past month, those lawsuits have been finally court-approved, settled, although the settlement in those cases is for the parties to get together on a remedy that ends the stop and frisk abuse. So there's a community process that will go on where the police department has to hear from community members about their concerns, and there's a court-appointed monitor who is going to oversee changes in practices and policies and training, and monitor the situation for a couple of years. Of course, the irony of all this is that the lawsuits were just one of many reasons that one of many paths to change with regard to stop and frisk, because we started with 700,000 at the peak, and this year we are on track for under 50,000 stop and frisks. So even though we haven't even gotten to the remedy process, right? Stop and frisk. One of the lawyers in my office said to me, "Stop and frisk is over," right? As an issue, stop and frisk is over. I didn't quite say that, and I won't, because I think that any of these issues, they never go away. They may go to sleep for a while, but they can always come back. There's a famous saying, the fight for civil liberties never stays won. You have to fight over and over and over again. Man, is that true? But I do think that we have won the battle of stop and frisk. We won it in the public arena, I think, and we won it by using data, facts, about the disparities and the total lack of connection to crime, and we won it through litigation and other pressure. But so that's good news. Numbers are down, lawsuits settled, monitor in place, but we still have a police commissioner who unabashedly as the mayor calls himself a progressive, the police commissioner touts broken windows policing. And broken windows policing is associated with the stop and frisk abuse, but somehow that's not happening anymore. What is continuing to happen is the summons blitz and the minor arrest blitz. You know, back in the really, when there were lots of neighborhoods in New York that were dangerous, you know, including my own, the lion's share of police work was devoted to major crimes. Now, the lion's share of police work is devoted to marijuana, right? You know, open containers, ooh, you know, disorderly conduct, and other misdemeanors. Those are all violations, you know, but misdemeanors as well. And so we have over 250,000 or about 250,000 summonses issued a year, and the biggest offense is marijuana. So you know, I don't really want to engage in a conversation about broken windows policing, because it's one of those things that you can hate it, you can love it, you can, you know, but the important thing is, like, what do police practices consist of? You know, are we seeing, you know, a zero tolerance, hyper-aggressive police approach to communities of color that doesn't do anything to make those communities any safer, to make the city any safer, you know, but does an enormous amount of damage to the lives of the people who are impacted by that? And when people are arrested and put through the system, whether it's for a robbery or for shoplifting or for marijuana possession, right? Chances are you spend overnight in jail, maybe longer, depending on what, you know, when it happens. Certainly, if it happens on the weekend, and maybe longer if you don't have money, right? You know, I think a third or maybe more of the people in Rikers Island, which we all know is a hellhole, are in because they can't pay less than $500 bail. Okay, so and what happens? Even when you get a summons, even just a little summons, a discount summons, nothing, garbage, right? What happens is that if you are a kid and don't show up, or if you're just an ordinary person who didn't know what was happening or didn't know you had to go to court, you know, you're one of those people who doesn't pay your parking tickets and you didn't deal with this thing either, right? Well, they issue a bench warrant for you. So the next time you're out walking your dog without a leash, right? When you don't just get a summons, you get hauled into jail, right? And when you go to summons court, you should take a walk down to is it 243 Broadway? 346 Broadway. Check out the line in Summons Park, even in Manhattan. There aren't a lot of white people on it. It's almost all people of color. And it's a zoo. It's a total zoo. You know, there may be one 18B lawyer there, but you're not entitled to a lawyer on a violation charge if there's no jail time threatened. It's staffed not by DAs, but by corp counsel, I believe. And it takes an enormous amount of time, and the cops never show up. Your accuser never shows up. So if you want to fight it, you know, either they'll agree to dismiss it, right? And all you've lost is a day of work and whatever, you know, inconvenience it was in the interaction, right? You know, or you have to come back and miss another day's work. And for some people, missing a day's work isn't such a big deal. I could take a day off, no problem, you know, and I would not get fired for it. But there are a lot of people who don't have the kind of track record or job, right, that allows them to just take off, right? So And the other thing about summons court, and I think this is like a dirty little secret, I really do, sort of when you plead guilty or you're found guilty in summons part, guess what happens? You don't only get a fine, you have to pay court costs. So we charge people for being in the system. We're making the people who can least afford it, I would venture to say, like pay fees to be put through the system. Kind of sucks. So I think, oh shoot, you know, do you have this problem with the glasses and the hair? Anyway, I think that the summons blitzing, you know, is, and it goes on your record, you know, most of the time or some of the time. I think the summons blitzing, while a lot less intrusive than being thrown up against the wall or down on the ground and searched or patted down, is a problem. And I believe, and the other thing about summonses is that during the last year of the Kelly administration, they changed the forms. So almost none of the summonses that are given out indicate the race or ethnicity of the individual getting the summons. So one of the big issues for us is, you know, transparency is, you know, hey, we want to know, just like we wanted to know about stop and frisk, right? Who was being impacted by this? And just as it was critically important for the public discourse, right, to know what the racial lopsidedness was about that, we all need to know what the racial lopsidedness of summons policy is as well. And so there, and I think the best example of the racially biased policing that we have is actually with regard to marijuana arrests. I love marijuana arrests as a topic. I was gonna say I love marijuana. And why? Because, you know, we don't really have good data on like low-level offenses. Who's disorderly? You know, who jaywalks? Who has open containers? You know, we know where, and the police always say, well, we just go where the crime is, you know? And the thing about marijuana is we have good data for decades about who uses and sells marijuana, because those are public health. There are epidemiological surveys of who uses marijuana in the United States. And white people smoke marijuana a lot more than do people of color, as it turns out. But who gets arrested and who gets a summons for marijuana in New York City? Yep. Not just 60%, not just 70%, 90% of the people who get arrested for marijuana are people of color. 90%. I mean, that's just not like, that's like, whoa, that's crazy. And so Mayor de Blasio, I think with the best of intentions, announced a new program just the other day about marijuana, right? They said, we are really, really, really going to stop arresting so many people for marijuana. We're going to start giving people only a summons. It's just a summons, you know, and so we know that there are collateral consequences, and if they don't do something about the summons form, about what they report to the public, we're not going to know whether the racial disparities that plagued their arrest policies, you know, are going to plague their summons policies. So the bad news is that instead of saying, you know what, we have to enforce the law, but we think it's crazy to spend so much time and energy on marijuana, we are going to make that the lowest priority of the police department, which some other jurisdictions that have not legalized marijuana have done. They said, we're going to just give out summonses for for plain view marijuana. But if you're smoking a joint on the street and you're a person of color, you still get arrested. Theoretically, you still get arrested if you're white. But we know that 90 to 10, it's people of color who have to worry about it. So they did not do what I think I would have hoped a progressive mayor would have done, which is saying, we're not do what Ken Thompson said, we're not arresting people for low-level marijuana. We're not even giving summonses. We have better things to do with our cops, right? They said, we are going to give out summonses that are a little worse than a parking ticket. So it's not nothing, but it's not like, it's not a major change, and it's not, we'll see. And so, and the other piece of good news is that they have agreed, although it hasn't yet happened, to sort of change the summons form so that we can document the impact. So that's good. And the impact is going to be not just the racial implications, but also like who's getting bench warrants and what are the consequences of bench warrants, and how are we going to reduce the likelihood that people get thrown in jail for just a little summons. Okay, I spent too much time talking about that. I'm going to move on from marijuana to education. I believe, I sat down with the state, the leadership of the state education department a couple of years ago, talking about high stakes testing. And I was asked, why are you here? Why is this your issue? I said, you don't get it? Anyway, the New York Civil Liberties Union is deeply committed to equal opportunity in education and believes that, just as, like, you know, was it Earl Warren said back in 1954, education is critical to the future of our young people. And if you don't have access to education, then you don't have access to your civil and political rights and to participate fully in civil society. And so it's a big priority for us. And the main issue that we have been involved in the city, but not the only issue, has to do with school discipline. And there has been, over the past 12 years, a remarkable transformation of the culture in our schools, for which the education mayor deserves full blame. And that is the criminalization of our young people. What used to be a trip to the principal's office has become a trip to the precinct. And I kid you not, I could give you case after case, example after example of kids, junior high school kids, thrown into handcuffs, marched off to the precinct for writing on the desk, for refusing to put the tray away in the cafeteria, for refusing to take the cap off in the assembly, for being pissed off at the metal detector and refusing to go through again. Every day, thousands of our kids, thousands of them, can't get into their school. Bye, Mom! You know, without going through a metal detector, without being patted down, without having their book bags opened, sometimes toppled, and all their personal stuff out there. So, and the other thing that has happened in our schools is that what used to be a reprimand, you know, I pine for the days when I shall not, you know, when that was how they punished kids, because what happens nowadays is that kids are suspended for long periods of time for misbehavior. Now, kids need discipline, don't get me wrong, and schools have to be safe, of course. You can't learn if you're afraid. Teachers can't teach if they're afraid. But the responsibility for maintaining order in the schools has been delegated to the police, school safety officers, which has led to teachers coming to rely on school safety to do what teachers used to do, and principals used to do. And some of them are happy about it, and most of them are not. And the resort to what we call exclusionary discipline. You know, they claim they send you to a suspension center, an alternative learning center, right, where they don't have courses you need to graduate, where they don't send work back to your school, which could be 2 hours or an hour from your home. For months. You know, in other school districts, it's like considered an expulsion to be out of school for more than 30 or 60 days. In New York City, you never get expelled. You could be suspended for a year, but you never get expelled. You tell me that that's not an expulsion. And so those two phenomena have been devastating to the most vulnerable kids. And what's even worse and kind of sad is that kids with special needs who have, you know, are supposed to have individualized learning plans, and kids who have behavioral issues who are supposed to have individualized behavioral plans are most at risk for being suspended or arrested for misbehaving. So on the one hand, I won't go into the pathetic state of special services for special needs kids, but kids who have medical conditions, who have diagnosed conditions, are like thrown on the ground for doing what they were supposed to do when they got agitated, right? You know, there was one kid who walks out of the bathroom, goes into the bathroom, there's graffiti on the wall, he said, and he goes to the school safety officer and says, somebody wrote on the wall. And the school safety officer goes into the bathroom, sees there's graffiti on the wall, and says, you did it. And the kid says, I didn't. And basically tells the kid, you know, you're going to be arrested. And the kid throws a fit. And before you know it, this kid who has been making all sorts of progress, right, whether he did it or not, right, was down on the ground in handcuffs, right, and totally set back. Not just hurt in that instant, but totally scarred and set back for a long time. So you know, it's kind of, I think it should be shocking and unbelievable to you. And all I can say is, trust me, it's true. You know, you could read our reports or whatever. And when Bloomberg was in office, and the case of the handcuffing of a 5-year-old because he threw a tantrum got a lot of press, you know, and they were embarrassed by that, and they tried to act as if they were doing something about it. I remember Ray Kelly saying, we recognize that we have problems. Thank you, Commissioner. We are going to begin a pilot program where we will no longer be using plastic handcuffs on 5-year-olds. What a progressive town. Oh, I'm not done. This was like a laugh line that I used, you know. We're going to be using Velcro handcuffs. So let me tell you, we may have a new police commissioner, but we still handcuff kids who are 5 and 6 and 7 years old, okay? Just had a case the other week. Suspensions are slightly lower, that's true. Arrests are slightly lower. Summonses are slightly lower, or a lot lower, actually. But kids are still getting summonses to go to 346 Broadway, to a criminal proceeding, right, for engaging in the offense of disorderly conduct in school. And I think that says it all, right? Our schools continue to throw kids into the criminal justice system. That's hence the name, you know, the phrase school to prison pipeline. And it's 10 months into the de Blasio administration. And while we have had some fabulous conversations with his administration, We have talked to him. You know, our proposal to the de Blasio administration about what to do is we need, you'll laugh at me, we need a task force to deal with this problem. Why do we need a task force? Because it's a really complicated problem. You know, the educators are not equipped right now to take back responsibility for school safety. They're not. They've been deprogrammed from using their management skills. And quite honestly, in the bad old days, the DOE blew it. They did a terrible job. There's more thoughtfulness in the police department about the complicated nature of the issues, at least in the upper echelons, you know, than there had been, in the DOE. So we're not saying get the cops out of the schools. What we are saying is the system of where cops don't answer to educators, and there are 5,000 cops, which would make it, by the way, the 5th largest police department in the whole country. Amazing. And 3,000 guidance counselors. Oh, priorities. That we need to have a conversation that includes the Department of Health, mental health, about the mental health services that are necessary, that requires, that develops training for both teachers and cops at the same time, and develops protocols, a whole new protocol for who runs the school. So we asked for a task force, and I am kicking myself. We're 10 months into the administration. They like that idea of a task force. If it takes us 10 months and we still don't have a task force announced, imagine how quickly we're going to implement whatever change we can believe in comes out of that task force. So I'm getting like a little bit itchy, and I can't believe that they have yet to announce an end to the cell phone ban. You know, Bloomberg's cell phone ban, right, was like the laughing stock, except it was like a cruel joke on the kids, right? And many principals just ignored it. But for kids of color, whose principals were less likely to ignore it, you know, it was either you had to pay like $180 a year to check your cell phone at the bodega down the block, or more. One of the schools recently set up a cell phone check-in place in the school for free for the kids because the local bodega raised its price to $5 a day. Right? This is like tuition. Is this the privatization? Anyway, I haven't even gotten to talk about the privatization of education and the testing mania. Anyway, so I mean, de Blasio has acknowledged our concerns and has said that he agrees with us that kids should not be arrested for being kids, that kids need supports, that they need positive behavioral interventions, that teachers need training, that cops need training. And he's brought together a lot of people to talk about it. We have yet to see any change. We still have metal detectors in schools. There is still no process for schools to get rid of metal detectors when they want to. There's still no finite period of time that if a school needs a metal detector, and let's say that there could be a school that needs a metal detector, there's still no finite period of time after which you do a reassessment and decide whether it's necessary for the kids. So this is an area where I have really high hopes, and I'm struggling, to put it mildly. So there are other education issues that are, I think, critical to the future of our kids that are going to be decided probably in the context of the budget this year. Civil Liberties Union never gets involved in the budget. Numbers, money, who gets how much, that's how I used to think about it. But it turns out that in New York State, a lot of political issues get decided in the context of the budget. Like the Rockefeller drug law reform was done as a budget bill, you know, saving money, I guess. I think one of the issues that we weighed in a big way last year on was the proposal for tuition tax credits for private schools and for charter schools. And that, to me, just right out of the gate, was government subsidies of parochial schools. It was government tuition vouchers, which we fought when it was called that, and a lot of people fought it, and we were successful in some places and unsuccessful in others. Well, here in New York, what I call the Unholy Alliance got together last year, and it will be back this year, pressing for tuition tax credits for people who, for people to send their kids to private schools, including religious schools, for people who fund charter schools, and I find this kind of scary. What was proposed last year and didn't succeed was a bill that would have given a tax credit to investors in charter schools so that in addition to the tax write-off they got for making a charitable contribution, you deduct, where you itemize your deductions, that credit, they would also get a dollar for dollar credit against their income taxes for the amount of the donation. And the result of it was that a contribution to the charter schools or to a religious scholarship fund or a private school like Dalton or Brearley's scholarship fund, right, would result in a return on investment for people in the highest tax brackets of about 20%. So it was an investment gimmick pitched as a tax credit. And of course, this is education dollars that are kind of sort of desperately needed for public schools that are being siphoned in as a profit-making vehicle for parochial and charter schools. I called it the Unholy Alliance because it's the charter school people who pay their principals and superintendents like $300,000 a year, and the Catholic Church. I'm not sure the extent to which the Orthodox Jewish schools are part of that. Speaking of religious schools, so here's another area, education area, where there's a mixed review. Universal pre-K, I think it's great. 50,000 kids in pre-K funded by the state and city, that's great. Bravo, Mayor de Blasio, he made it happen. The governor, who is always got a keen eye for something that's going to boost his political standing, got on that train. But then de Blasio made a big deal of saying we welcome all providers of pre-K. So yes, this is open to religious providers. The religious nursery schools are eligible for this program. So we immediately wrote letters to, we got on the phone to the mayor's council, former ACLU staffer, and other people in the administration. And we looked at the RFP, the request for proposals, and we looked at the contracts, and we said, we really hate the idea of this money going to religious programs. It's fraught, it's dangerous, it presents the danger that government funding will be used to promote religion. And we said, so here's what you can do to beef up the existing rules that are designed to make sure that these are secular programs. We told them, one good thing is that the Bloomberg administration bequeathed you a contract, a standard contract, that prohibits employment discrimination, prohibits religious pre-K programs from preferring people of the faith. That's a good thing. And we were pleasantly surprised to see that. But you have to strengthen the prohibition against, curriculum, religious curriculum, et cetera. And you have to audit the programs. You have to go in and look at what's going on in the classrooms. So they said, thank you. We'll get back to you. And we had conversations. We were very open and straight up about it, what we liked, what we didn't like. Well, we wanted to get back to you. We want to let you know we haven't yet decided about doing an audit. You have to understand, we sued the Salvation Army in the city and state of New York because they had a form on their for employees in their government-funded social services programs that required their employees to conduct their government-funded work, AIDS programs, adoption programs, child care programs, stuff like that, funded by the government, that required their social workers to do their jobs, to perform their services in accordance with the gospel according to our Lord Jesus Christ. And so we sued based on that. And we got a settlement out of the city and the state that said that they would audit the programs to make sure that they did not proselytize with government funds. It's a no-brainer, right? Thank you. So what is the de Blasio administration? They haven't done the audit, right? What have they get? They said, you're not going to be happy about this. We eliminated the non-discrimination clause. Religious institutions, churches, are exempt from the prohibition against discriminating in employment based on creed, and of course they should not have to hire priests of any faith, duh, right? But when it comes to the janitor, the secretary, the building maintenance guy, what role does religion play in that? But the law is not clear about that. So I was pleased that there was this language in the old contract, but the de Blasio administration eliminated that clause in the contract. And so they said, you are free to the extent permitted by law, to prefer members of the faith. So that was one thing. And then the other, pathetic pandering to the religious lobby, whichever one they're pandering to, right, was to issue in their guidelines that the pre-K programs can use religious texts in the classroom, but only for cultural purpose, not for teaching religion. So Jesus is like an adventure hero, right? Or, I don't know, Moses, he's a magician, right? So, it is the craziest, really pandering that you could imagine. And I have to be honest with you, it's going to be really, really hard for us to go after them because we don't have access to these programs, and chances are they only advertise their programs to people of the faith, right? And so basically, the pre-K program, as much as I love it, right, is also being a funnel of government money for religious education, and that sucks, and that's not being a progressive mayor, in my opinion. The issue of church-state is one of the thorniest, most challenging issues we've faced. Most of it, it doesn't hurt people in an obvious way, but people don't get it. People don't get how important it is and where it manifests, to have a secular government, and that it really is important that government not be the funder of religious activities. And a lot of the people that I work with on policing, on justice issues, wouldn't talk to me. When it came to the issue of whether churches can use the schools as their place of worship on Sunday. We took the position that Bloomberg was right on that. Bloomberg was right on something. You heard it here first, right? because he said, I'm not going to have churches using my schools as a place of worship. That crosses the line. It lends the appearance that we endorse religion. And by the way, there's a whole church planting movement that seeks to sort of take over public schools and make them identified with their churches. And some of those churches are like the ones that promote sort of the gospel according to homosexuality is the work of the devil kind of stuff. So I mean, there are all sorts of problems there. And that's another area where the de Blasio administration, there's a lawsuit that the city fought, like doggedly for years, brought by the churches against the city for barring them from worshiping. And because like the courts, the city kept winning mostly the lawsuit, but the lower courts kept staying the city's victory. And so basically churches have been using public schools as houses of worship for like about a decade now. And the case went up to the Court of Appeals, the appellate court in the Second Circuit, which covers New York. And it's been up and down to the Court of Appeals like I think 3 times. And finally the Court of Appeals says this policy of barring churches from worshiping in our public schools is lawful, and congratulations, New York City, you win. And then literally within a day, de Blasio says, well, we're going to change that policy. They have yet to promulgate their rules, but the churches are still in the schools. You go to PS3, right? At least they used to be a house of worship on Sunday, and it's all like Sundays are the days that it's available. So it's all anyway. So anyway, there's been change. I can wrap my arms around and change that I can't, and regression that I can't. I would like. Let me see what time it is. Do I have to stop? Are we? What time am I supposed? I'm supposed to leave some time for questions. Okay, so let me just say a couple more things. So this is over at. Is it over at 2:15? No. It's okay. Another 15. Okay, so I just want to say, well, I'll just throw out some issues. So Ebola, right? The quarantine. The governors. The bully governors, had their press conference and said, we're quarantining anybody who comes into JFK who's been a doctor without borders. Good work, guys, but like, screw you. And there are, I'm happy to talk about that if you ask a question about it. I think the city approached it in relatively the right way, which is like, we're going to take medically sound approaches. If people are dangerous, they go into quarantine. If they're not dangerous and they've been exposed, then we know that then we know that we have to monitor them. And there's a world of difference between being monitored by the health department and being locked up in your apartment. Okay, so the city was a lot better than the state. They were imperfect, trust me. But anyway, and another thing, I was going to show you pictures, but I won't. It's a good thing I showed that clip at the beginning, right? This was the year that we won our lawsuit about the right to counsel. It's 50 years after Gideon, right? Everybody's got a right to counsel when they're charged with a crime. And the system of public defense in New York State sucks. There have been commission after commission after commission that have documented how profoundly wrong it is. And the reason it's wrong is because the state says to the counties, do it, here's a little bit of money. And there's no standards for lawyers, for caseloads. There's no training available. And so it depends on where you happen to get arrested, whether or not you get a halfway decent lawyer. That sucks. So we have been in litigation between the time the 3 years it took us to prepare the litigation and the time it took us to sort of settle the lawsuit based on the dysfunction in 5 counties, only 5 counties we covered, right, for 10 years. And through all these progressive governors and attorneys general, through Spitzer, through Patterson, and Cuomo. It was only under Cuomo, no thanks to Cuomo, that we were ultimately able to resolve the lawsuit. We were on the eve of trial, right, when they finally agreed to settle the case. And they settled it in a good way. I think we've set up a model for how to make it happen. But remember I said the fight for civil liberties never stays won? We're going to have to fight for funding so that the State Office of Indigent Legal Services can do its job and provide caseload assessments and limits, mandates for interpreters and investigators and forensic experts, and training and oversight of what goes on in the counties. So that's like, it's one of those like sort of reality checks. You thought, you live in New York City, if a kid gets arrested, they get legal aid, they'll do a decent job, right? And there's something resembling justice. So what if it's only black kids who go through the system, right? At least they'll have a lawyer. I was joking, that was a joke. So I think that the abject failure of public defense statewide should be shocking, or maybe shocking, and the NYCLU had to spend decades with progressive people in power, supposedly, or Democrats, okay. Not progressive, Democrats, and they fought us tooth and nail, and until it came down to trial. I mean, we were up to the Court of Appeals and down. They litigated the pants off this case, and we won. It's a huge victory, but we still have a long way to go before we can say with confidence that the right to counsel is a reality for all New Yorkers. I haven't even gotten to talk about Rikers Island, but you can ask about it if you want to. Okay, questions? Yes. I don't want to sound anti-Semitic either. Where do we stand about Kiryat Joel? Do you know what Kiryat Joel is? It's like a Hasidic school district that was created by the elder Cuomo as a whatever. So that is disgusting. It is a total affront to the notion of this as a secular society, and it's an example of the political payoffs that I mean, the sort of transactional politics, and nobody has been able to sort of do anything about it. What's worse, I think, than Kiryat Joel is what's going on in East Ramapo, sort of where the people who don't send their kids to public schools have taken over the school board. It's the Hasidic community, and the kids who go to the schools are all black and Latino kids. And what they have done is decimate the public schools. They have stripped them of funding, and they have, siphoning off money to religious programs, and it's just, the state education department, has failed to over the years to take this issue on. I mean, they finally appointed a monitor. I don't know that they're doing what they need to or not, but it's as we would say, a shanda. Yeah.
I have two questions, simple questions, I think. I know the answers won't be.
I'll answer one.
Well, as a teacher, I know our schools are more segregated than they've ever been. As a teacher, I know that our schools have more segregated than they've ever been in the history of New York City. My question is, there's any legal ramifications to that? My second question is, I'm very, very interested in the New York City Police Department surveillance system and the illegality of particularly the Islamophobia, how they're surveilling mosques and people who are Muslims, and their violations of civil liberties and rights. So those are two questions. I know they're difficult.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for either of them. I mean, New York State has the most segregated schools in the country. That's pretty astounding. And under the Bloomberg administration and his admissions policies, the schools were made even more segregated. I don't believe in gifted and talented programs for the most part, and certainly not in elementary school. So you can, it's okay. That's just personal. But they changed the criteria for the gifted and talented program. They wanted to get rid of any kind of cronyism, favoritism, and so they changed the rules, and so they became even more segregated. G&T programs in the Bronx were shuttered. G&T programs in the poorest neighborhoods in Brooklyn were shuttered, all in the name of some meritocracy that was all based on tests. And so I think that, Brad Lander has a bill in the city council which is designed to sort of not solve the problem but tackle it. In District 1, they tried to have admissions policies that included diversity as a factor, and they were shot down by Bloomberg Klein. So I think that and it's kind of chastening to me personally that us being the most segregated school system in the nation is not the top thing that I talk about. But the reason that it's not is because we have yet to figure out how we're going to go about fixing that. It's a terrible, terrible problem. With regard to Islamophobia, we have lawsuits pending about the surveillance of mosques and Muslim organizations all over the city based on not the standard and legitimate criteria, which is suspicious activity, but based on being Muslim. And it's all about fear, and it's the same kind of, it's different, but it's the same thing that prompted or that enabled the governor Sees to get away with, saying we're going to put anybody who is at risk for Ebola, into quarantine. When people are afraid, and New Yorkers are, and the country is still afraid, and ISIL doesn't help, of terrorism. We all have legitimate concerns about terrorism, but when we're afraid, we stop thinking, and so our insistence, as political human beings on rational policies that are geared towards actual risks kind of, goes into the ether, and we just act like we're afraid. And so even though when you brand, people by virtue of their religion as suspect, and that that's going to miss the people who are going to be terrorists with a different religion or without a religion, and it's going to terrorize a lot of innocent people who happen to share that religion. The public support for an anti-terrorism program that comports with our values and actually comports with common sense is really, not as strong. And so while I expect that the police department may well make some changes in its surveillance practices, I think that they say that when the cops show up on a crime-ridden street corner, a drug corner, the drugs just move. I feel like the police department's tactics are going to just change a little bit, and we'll have to figure out what they were and challenge them down the pike too. I don't have high hopes on that, so I do expect some changes, and there has been some conversations, but it's a problem. It's a problem. And, I think sort of like the silos that we as New Yorkers sort of live our lives in are really harmful. I think one of the few areas, there are more, but, one of the few areas where you see sort of people, sort of living their lives across the divides, is like in kids' sports. I'm sure there are others, but it's really, the wealth gap, the enormous private school population in New York City just really hurts us build the community. And when you don't interact with people in your everyday life, it's so easy to turn them into a stereotype, whether it's based on religion, being Muslim or Jewish or Christian or whatever. So these are challenges that we face, yeah.
Our government officials are spending thousands of dollars to install all types of technology to, quote unquote, keep safe streets and even perhaps monitor anti-terrorism activities. And then we have additional city agencies like DOITT that are providing all kinds of technologies to various agencies. And then you have NYPD with a private video network with private businesses called NYPD Shield. And then you have FDNY, where you have documented anti-Semitism from the former commissioner's son. And I myself personally have been stalked for the last 5 years by a combination of FDNY and other utility-type worker personnel. So, and I noticed that in your website you talk about your office having done some work in, I think, Erie County for the possible improper use of stingray technology to GPS and track people. I was wondering whether your agency has done anything to look at either DOITT technologies or NYPD's private Shield video network, or to further look at FDNY's sharing of 911 technologies with NYPD and the possible implications their history of racist attitudes could in fact be used against the public.
So, the issue of technology as a vehicle, the proliferation of technology is a real challenge for all of us. The horse is way out of the barn. Everybody's got a smartphone, almost everybody. You put on the phone tracking thing so that not only can you find your phone when you lose it, and we all lose it at some point, but so can the government track you. And and we have, a whole range of technologies that can be helpful and can be devastating. I was in South Africa in June for a conference where there were people from a lot of different countries, including like Uganda. And I'm sitting there, with my smartphone and, all the GPS stuff that's on it and thinking about how, our government says, don't worry about it. We're just getting the websites you visit, but we're not looking beyond that. And we're not going to use it unless we have a reason to. And I'm thinking, oh God, in Uganda, it's a crime to be gay. And so, it's very easy to figure out, who's either gay or interested in gay issues. That's enough, round them up, and so there's our sense that government is not going to bother us with its surveillance, the surveillance capacity that has built in the name of protecting us from terrorism, is really a reflection of the massive denial that we're all in, perhaps, or perhaps a profound optimism that no matter what criticisms we have of government, they're not going to screw us, because I'm not doing anything wrong. So we have tried to press for limits on government access to information it gets using technology or however. It's a kind of the horse is way out of the barn. That doesn't mean we've given up on trying to ensure that they destroy records that they collect of, that the police department collects about innocent comings and goings. But it's really, I can't say that we've been very successful at that. Yeah.
Let us thank, it's enough, let us thank Donna Lieberman. Thank you.
Thank you.
There is some coffee and cookie and you still can talk to her.
Right. And listen, if any of you have not yet become card-carrying members of the ACLU, there's still time. You can do it online at nyclu.org.